Você está preparado? Você sabia que obedecer é melhor que sacrificar? A mídia mostra a mentira oficial. Somos poucos, mas estamos fazendo barulho.
Thank you for coming tonight. We are live streaming this to a lot of people out there, and we want this message to go out far and wide. So tonight is very important. Now, any of you that have heard the shadow government speech before, this is that speech on steroids. So I think we'll have some eye-opening stuff here that I think a lot of people are going to see, and God willing, we'll be able to make a change. I always like to say I call myself a recovering CI officer. I go through CI Officers Anonymous, but that group is not a 12-step program. It's a 24-step program. The first 12 steps, we learn how to tell the truth again, and that's the hardest part. I also like to say that when you're a CI whistleblower, there are some perks to that, believe it or not. For example, I get my mail is open before I get it. It's kind of nice. It's like, well, thank you for that. Somebody's already been in it. My cell phone turns itself on and off, especially when I have these meetings. My wife will tell you, the cell phone will just come on right before we come and do this sort of thing. Well, that's convenient, though. That you could look at that maybe as a perk, couldn't you? If I ever get lost, we travel a lot. If I ever get lost, there's always someone following me, so I can go back and ask directions. That's pretty cool. So, there are some perks for doing this, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else, I'll tell you that much. So it's been pretty interesting. I like to start out a little lighthearted because this is a very, very heavy topic. As my friend who introduced me and I talked about earlier, we're not just at the 11th hour, we're at the 11th hour 59-minute point in this country constitutionally. I'm sorry to say that we are living under a post-constitutional government in America now, and it's getting worse by the hour. There's a war going on in Washington. I'll talk about some of that tonight. Some of this information is the first that we've ever presented. And as some of you know, I take a bit of a risk in doing this every time I do it, and we've been living this for about 4 years, but it has to be done, because this is so important what we're up against in this country. I consider myself really duty-bound. I touched on... Yeah, thank you.
Honey, I'm so afraid you will.
Yeah, and you're now famous. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I was kind of watching that. Thank you. I owe you some kind of safety award, or there'll be a brown bag wrapped up in the back for you later on. No, just kidding. I touched on this in California. Did anybody out there see the California speech that I gave, I think it was this past July? That speech, I think, to date has hit 2 million views, I think, already on YouTube, and it's gone viral. And that is just a fragment of what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, I'm going to get into quite a bit of detail, and we're going to go the full span, so feel free if you have to get up and move or something, that's perfectly fine. We're live streaming this to a lot of people out there, and the primary purpose of tonight is to do that because we want to get this message out to as many people as we can. So thanks for coming. I give this speech to any group that will take the risk to do it. Some do and some don't. The mainstream media has avoided this, and I will explain why that is later on. You'll see why that is. There are a lot of sectors that don't want this information becoming public. I talked to GOP groups, constitutional groups, libertarian groups, Tea Party groups, and I have to tell you, I meet some of the most wonderful people you could meet at these meetings. Just freedom-loving, good Americans you meet coming to these speeches, and it's really fulfilling for me. It's the best of the best. I was asked, I have a good friend, Dane Wigington, out on the West Coast. The first speech anybody took the risk to let me get up and talk about this was Dane, out in California. He's the president of geoengineeringwatch.org. He is probably one of the most professional people I've ever worked with. Now, I am no expert on geoengineering by any stretch. That's Dane's area of expertise. He asked me to come and talk about my expertise, and that is government cover-up, the shadow government, and how they silence whistleblowers. So that's what I do. He doesn't talk about chemtrails. Dane, just in his credit talks about geoengineering. Now, the interesting part of that is, one of the reasons I went out to talk to Dane and his group was the director of the CIA, John Brennan, went before the Council on Foreign Relations. Anybody know what that is? We'll talk about that tonight, and some of that will curl people's hair. The director of the CIA, John Brennan, went before the Council of Foreign Relations last year and said that he has gained a personal interest in geoengineering, and specifically strategic aerosol injection. That the CIA and the Council on Foreign Relations are interested in geoengineering. Now, I can tell you, as a former CIA officer, if they come out, the CIA comes out and says anything publicly like that before the Council on Foreign Relations, which created the CIA, you need to take note of that. Because if they're saying it publicly, my experience being in there is they're already doing it, or they've been planning on doing it for some time. So you can actually go on CIA.gov, and you can see John Brennan give that presentation for the Council on Foreign Relations. So maybe Dane's onto something. But I want to give him credit because he's the first person that had the guts to let me come out and talk about some of this stuff in public. So kudos to him. All right. I also like to say I am not a Democrat, nor am I a Republican. I'm a constitutionalist. I'm an independent. For me, it's all about the Constitution based on where I come from, and I've seen some of the worst of the worst. This is not a conservative or liberal talk at all. It's completely nonpartisan. What I'm trying to do is bring people together under the United States Constitution, because what they want to do is they want to divide us and split us apart. And if they can do that, especially globally, they can eliminate what America is and the unity that we have. And you can see that with all the unrest and all the racial stuff and all the protests. A lot of that is coming down from some of the globalist financiers that are financing some of these groups with the intent of dividing America. So I want everybody to understand that. Don't fall into that trap, because they're trying to split us up. And it comes from a global level. I'm doing this because I adore this country and our constitutional government and our constitutional republic. That's what drives me and that's what motivates me. I risked my life for this country, literally, when I was in the CIA, and I'm seeing this country being degraded and taken apart. Sadly, the CIA is a part of that, and we'll be talking about that. I risked my life. I swore an oath to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. Sadly, one of our biggest enemies to our freedoms happens to be a domestic one, and it's coming from our own government. And that sounds shocking when you first say it, but when we get into some detail here and we actually prove it, you'll find out that it is indeed the truth, that from the inside out is where the attack is coming from, the really serious one. There are certain dark parts of our own government I call personally the shadow government. That's what we'll be talking about. Some call it the deep state, and the deep state does exist. What my point is, coming from the CIA, is the deep state and the shadow government are not the same thing. They're used interchangeably, but the shadow government and the deep state are not the same entity. They are joined together in a matrix, but they are not one and the same. And I'll explain how that is and why that is. And it's important to know that. They're both a threat to our Constitution. I come from the belly of the beast, the deep secret inner workings of the government that no one sees on the outside, the massive system of secrecy and the matrix of secret intelligence agencies that are now manipulating our elected officials behind the scenes. There's a serious threat to our democracy and our constitutional republic by the shadow government and its associated deep state. In a few years, we may no longer have a constitutional republic. Some people think that we already do not have a constitutional republic, and I, sadly, personally happen to be one of those. That the Constitution is over, except for those of us that still adhere to it as the supreme law of the land. The government has superseded that in a gross fashion, and we're going to talk about that in detail this evening. If you could please hold your questions till the end, and I will be available at the back table when we are done. And I'll answer any questions that I can. I've met some of you personally that I've been talking with online, and some folks from previous speeches, so it's so good to have you here. And we're live streaming to a lot of folks, so welcome to everyone that's watching this tonight. We hope that will cause a bang. So, all right. I'm going to focus on the shadow government. the unconstitutional power of government secrecy. I call it the tyranny of secrecy. Our government has such a powerful, large matrix system of secrecy that it has literally taken over our elected government in a very complex fashion. They've been doing this for almost 60 years, and they've got it perfected. I always like to start my talks with this because it is so important. The Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. It's not a document of philosophy. It's not a written piece of ideology that's just a nice way for a country to do business or an ideology to follow. The Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. It supersedes the entire criminal justice system that we have underneath it. And that's important to understand because if someone violates the Constitution, they are breaking the law. It's a felony, okay? So if the government or any government agency violates the Constitution, like the Fourth Amendment, for example, they're breaking the law. That's a felony. That applies to citizens, and it applies to the government also. So if we remember that, we understand that, we're going to want to hold some people in Washington accountable for some of the things that are going on there. I mentioned that the shadow government and the deep state are two different entities, although they are joined together in this vast matrix that we see in Washington, D.C. and beyond. The deep state is the secret government, all of the secret intelligence agencies that are functioning in the dark behind the scenes. That is the shadow government. And it binds much of the deep state with secrecy, secret oaths, secrecy agreements, and other things that bind a lot of large contractors and others from saying anything about what they see. The deep state, however, is the system, and you can see I put a $ on system. The deep state is a system behind government. The military-industrial complex, I'll be talking about that. The currency of the shadow government is the power of secrecy, fear, and intimidation. That's the shadow government. I know because I was a part of that. I was a counterintelligence officer, interviewer, and that's how it works. The currency of the deep state is money, power, and greed. So they're two different things. They're joined together, which I'll explain. But they're two different things that function with two different systems of control that are manipulating our government behind the scenes. Let's look at this. I want to show you all the size, the power, and the extent of the shadow government or the secret government. This is the size. Each organization that I'm about to show you up here functions in secrecy and is bound by secret oaths from saying anything about what they see. When I was in there, I was in there during the Iran-Contra scandal and some other things, and you cannot talk about anything that you see, even if it's illegal or unconstitutional, because there's a system to systematically destroy you if you do. So, you remember the Council on Foreign Relations, established in 1921, came largely from the banking elite, the mortgage, the Rothschilds, and others, formed the Council on Foreign Relations. Council on Foreign Relations, eventually with the same members of the CFR, created the CIA. I think 21 CIA directors have all been members of the Council on Foreign Relations. That is an unconstitutional organization, and it has been since its founding in 1921. I'll get into that. And I'm taking a library of information and research and trying to distill this down into as short as I can get it. So there's a lot of stuff here, but we'll try to keep it simple. The Council on Foreign Relations in the beginning and the CIA had a direct established contract with the mainstream media. Philip and Catherine Graham of the Washington Post were members of the Council on Foreign Relations and directly connected to the CIA and directly connected to the CIA and CFR's program of pumping information into the news media for propaganda of the American people. And do you think that still continues today? There's no doubt about it. I will prove it later on. Most people will say, that passed away in 1976 with the end of Operation Mockingbird. Operation Mockingbird did not end. A lot of you shaking your heads, you know what I'm talking about. It's still here. Mainstream media is involved directly. Then you've got, of course, our beloved NSA. I know a couple of senior NSA whistleblowers. We tend to be friends when you're doing what we do because it's a small circle of riskies. And they've got a lot of things to say about NSA domestic surveillance and spying. So the NSA was created not by Congress, but via executive order outside of the Constitution, which most people don't know. It's got the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or the FISA court, which is a secret Supreme Court that functions outside of Congress and outside of the American people, and nobody knows what it does except grant warrants to domestically spy on U.S. citizens, which it has done in a gross fashion, as most of us know, with the NSA domestic surveillance program. More on that later. Silicon Valley now is directly connected to NSA. That's the way that the government does it. The CIA and the NSA, they approach Silicon Valley companies. I was in a military industrial complex. I was a program manager. They are always looking for big multi-million-dollar contracts. That's how you survive. That's how you stay alive. So the NSA, the CIA comes to them and says, hey, we got a $5-10 million contract. You sign up, we'll give this to you, and you can hook into Yahoo and Google and everybody else. And, it's worth, in this case, about $500 million total. So your average program manager says, I'll take it, and they sign up. What the CIA and NSA do then, because I executed thousands of these, they make you sign the piece of paper. Okay, you got this multi-million-dollar contract, but you cannot have access to anything until you sign the secrecy oath or the secrecy agreement with the CIA and NSA, which threatens you with administrative action, termination, or prison. If you mention anything connected with that operation, you can go to jail or worse. That's how they do it. Joint Special Operations Command is the president. People don't know this exists. It's the president's private army. The president of the United States can send the secret JSOC out into any country, and I think they're out there right now, into any country to conduct a special secret operation against that group of people to neutralize or whatever needs to be done in secret. That's the JSOC. The Director of National Intelligence, 17 federal agencies made up of tens of thousands of people are engaged in the shadow or secret government. 17 different intelligence agencies are part of the shadow government. It's massive. I'll show you the size here in a moment. Department of Homeland Security has its own secret branches. Department of State has its own secret branches. You remember when Secretary Hillary Clinton secretly ran guns into Libya, Benghazi, without anybody knowing about it, without Congress knowing about it? Those guns were given to the Free Syrian Army in Benghazi and eventually outside of Syria. The Free Syrian Army, claiming to be moderate Islamic rebels, many of them morphed into, guess who? ISIS. ISIS is now using U.S. tanks, U.S. weapons, and trained U.S. fighters. Some of which, they got some of the weapons from Iraq when we bailed out of Iraq. But a lot of ISIS branched out of the Free Syrian Army, and they have a lot of our weapons that they're using that we sent over there. That was conducted in secret. Did anybody here vote for that? Did anybody here vote for arming the Free Syrian Army in Syria with weapons? I don't see any hands. I never do, because we didn't. We didn't even know what was going on. That is the shadow government. Defense Intelligence Agency and